Thank you so much for coming. I certainly appreciate this hearing for peer-to-peer transportation options and regulations legislation in the City of Columbus. My name is Zach Klein. I'm the chair of the Public Safety Committee. I don't know if you have all had the chance to grab a copy agenda. I think there's a copy of the PowerPoint that Amanda Ford from Safety is going to be following through. If you want to grab that, it's right over there. The agenda actually is fairly simple. It's just this introduction followed by remarks from Director Mitch Brown, and then Assistant Director Amanda Ford will go through the PowerPoint presentation about what is being proposed in the City of Columbus for Uber and Lyft peer-to-peer transportation options. I can say that this is the second hearing on this issue. The first hearing took place when Councilmember Michelle Mills was the chair of Public Safety. So this is technically my first hearing, but total second hearing that the city has had on this subject. It's been a collaborative effort. I'd like to publicly thank Amanda Ford and Director Brown and the members of Public Safety that have gone above and beyond in working with the community and working with me and my staff, as well as both the livery, the taxi cab, and the peer-to-peer industry. It's been my goal from day one to recognize the similarities and differences between peer-to-peer and taxis, and bring where there are similarities, bring those in line to what's currently being required with taxi cabs, but also noting that there are differences in how we can effectuate effective regulation and reasonable regulation to recognize those differences. So at that, I'd like to recognize the City Attorney, Richard C. Pfeiffer, and certainly give him any opportunity to speak if he wishes. Okay, so Director Brown.
Councilmember Klein, and since there are no other members of council, first and foremost, I'd like to make sure and agree with you on a public statement that Amanda Ford and the City Attorney's Office have done an absolutely spectacular job in working with us in addressing the code that's required to concerns with regards to peer-to-peer. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to present for a second time the creation of 2 new code sections to address changes in the vehicle for hire industry. While we've been working for the past 6 months to create legislation that would allow for legal operations of UberX, Lyft, and other peer-to-peer transportation network companies. As you are well aware, technology is constantly changing. It has impacted nearly everything we do. Tech-savvy consumers want access to virtually everything that they do with the touch of their hand using their smartphone or an online application. Traditionally, taxicabs have served as the most common form of for-hire transportation for centuries. Taxicabs have conventionally been hailed from the street and clearly marked with signage. From the beginning, taxicabs have been equipped with taximeter, allowing for the fare to be calculated in front of the passenger. While taxicabs have added features over the years to benefit consumers, taxicabs still remain virtually the same for over a past century. In contrast, alternative forms of transportation continue to move into the market focused on offering the same service with a different look. Technology is used to link drivers using their personal vehicles, also referred to as peer-to-peer vehicles, with tech-savvy consumers. Peer-to-peer vehicles cannot be hailed from the street, but must be prearranged through an online application. This technology requires consumers to download an app, set up an online profile, and maintain a credit card on file prior to prearranging a ride. This technology allows the customer to know when the ride is expected to arrive, emails a detailed receipt of all fees charged to the consumer's credit card, and provides a platform for the consumer and driver to rate one another for the benefit of future transactions. While we know that this technology is not new, the form in which it is being offered is changing. Local taxi companies have begun partnering with popular apps that work the same way. When consumers request a ride through the app, they know that a taxi cab will be coming. Consumers know what to expect. When consumers log into a peer-to-peer company app, they know a vehicle will be coming that doesn't fit the traditional look and feel of a taxi cab. They can expect a driver in their personal vehicle that is not equipped with a taximeter, has a limited signage, and relies on an online app to determine the fare or suggested donation. At the end of the day, whether a consumer is using a traditional taxi cab or peer-to-peer vehicle, it is about the consumer protection and consumer choice. The City of Columbus has to ensure the public that all for-hire vehicles are safe, properly inspected, and that all drivers meet our standards. We don't know the full impact of this technology yet. We will have on the local vehicle for-hire industry. However, as these things progress, we will be able to determine their effectiveness. Ultimately, the competition will determine the ratio of traditional and alternative mode of transportation needed to balance the market. Those providing clean vehicles, reliable service, and excellent customer service will be highly competitive, while others may suffer. In the end, it requires everyone to step up their game and provide the best service and price possible to our consumers. Finally, we have two peer-to-peer companies that have launched their services prior to the City Council passing legislation. These companies are clearly in violation of the City Code. The license section has stepped up enforcement efforts and will continue to do so as we work to pass legislation. Once legislation is passed, companies and drivers will be expected to comply with the code or face legal recourse. I will now turn this presentation over to Amanda Ford, who will do a presentation on the screen, sir.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Klein. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. As you stated earlier, we've already held one hearing on March 13th to cover the drafted legislation, but we're not in a position to move forward as there were still many unanswered questions and work to be done. Over the past 7 months, I've met with Uber and Lyft multiple times to discuss several different drafts of this legislation, trying to find common ground where we could, but ensure that consumer protection was not compromised from the city's perspective. The city has always been welcoming to innovation and technology, and we are continuing that trend as we carve out this new legislation. But along with new technology and business concepts comes compromise. Rest assured that we worked through creating this legislation. There were plenty of compromises, but we felt it was imperative not to compromise public safety. I feel the legislation we are presenting today is consistent with how we regulate all vehicle for hires and have taken into consideration many of the issues that the peer-to-peer companies have brought forth. Finally, I will say it's been a challenge to create this legislation. Cities across the U.S. are struggling to how to properly regulate these companies, and very few have actually passed legislation. Many of the cities are in the same boat as Columbus. What to do, trying to ensure public safety, but allow for innovation. Sadly, there's no model legislation that has been tested and shown to work. Because of this, I have ensured my director, along with you with City Council and the industry, that we will sit down in 6 months to a year out from passing legislation to determine, if any, what changes need to be made. So on today's agenda, we're quickly going to go through a few of the proposed changes to 585, the Vehicle for Hire Board, and then go through 588 and 590 as it relates to peer-to-peer drivers and companies. Obviously, the reasons for the proposed changes: new companies have entered the local market, so online apps have become more popular for arranging transportation for drivers and passengers, and consumers want this service in the City of Columbus. So residents and visitors often use this in other cities and want the ability to use it locally. And then obviously public safety has always been our top concern. So we want to make sure that consumers are protected, but the enforcement is also critical. So it's important to note, just as the director did, that we do have two companies operating illegally in the city. So creating this legislation will require both companies to complete an application and meet the required standards in order to obtain a license. Once the license has been issued, they will be required to maintain our standards and follow the code or risk losing their license. So working on all of this, I constantly get asked by friends and family, why do I care so much about this issue? Why is it so important? So I just briefly wanted to talk real quickly why we issue a license in this city. So when my friends always ask me this, I quickly start my whole little spiel about why this is so important, that we're looking out for them, and they kind of laugh and say, okay, that's enough. So I just want to step back real quick and say, why do we issue licenses in the city? So obviously, the city has a vested interest in seeing that consumers are protected in commercial transactions, and consumers rely on protections when they've been victimized. So we issue license for many things in the license section that include peddlers who go door to door, peddlers who make sales in the public right-of-way, mobile food vendors, billiard rooms, arcades, carnivals, those requesting charitable solicitations, scrap metal dealers, and alarm dealers, just to name a few. We do these to protect consumers and provide an avenue for complaints and penalties for those who take advantage of consumers. And then finally, ensuring public safety. Obviously, making sure people are properly vetted. We do background checks on all individuals selling in the public right-of-way, including peddlers, mobile food vendors, alarm dealers, and vehicles for hired owners and drivers. These are all people who have direct, close contact with consumers, whether it's in a vehicle, their home, or on the street. So why do we license vehicle for hire services? Obviously, to ensure that consumers have safe, reliable transportation options in the city. So we want to properly examine all the drivers. We have a 7-year background check standard. Obviously, last year we just came to council and increased that from 2 years to 7 years. So we want to make sure that people are properly vetted and review their driver abstracts. We want to make sure that vehicles are properly inspected, requiring a third-party mechanical inspection by an ASC certified mechanic, and obviously make sure that insurance coverage is in place in the case of an incident. So as we get into the code changes, just quickly to go through 585, obviously this includes peer-to-peer vehicles as a vehicle for hire. It updates some of the definitions to include peer-to-peer by defining what a peer-to-peer transportation network company is, a driver, the network, along with several other definitions. And it adds representation of the peer-to-peer transportation network companies and drivers to the vehicle for hire board. So they will obviously have a say as we work on rules and regulations in the industry. As we move on to 588 and 590, I felt it was more important, instead of going line by line through the legislation, that we actually do a comparison to show how we regulate taxis, deliveries, and how it relates to peer-to-peer. So if you start at the top, the license requirements. Vehicle for hire owners are required to obtain a license, so that includes taxis, liveries. Peer-to-peer companies are not required to have that owner license, but instead they're required to have a peer-to-peer license. And all drivers, whether they are a vehicle for hire driver, meaning taxi cab driver, livery driver, pedicab operator, they are required to have a license, along with peer-to-peer drivers. The licensing fees, vehicle owners are required to pay $225 per cab or per livery vehicle. The peer-to-peer companies pay no per vehicle fee. Instead, they will pay a $15,000 licensing fee per year. What these fees do is they help us with the enforcement, help recover some of our costs. Obviously, a great deal of enforcement goes into the vehicle for hire industry because we do have strict standards and there are a lot of requirements that must be met. So we felt it was more appropriate to license the company, and we know that they don't want a lot of these costs passed on to their drivers. So they're picking up the costs for a lot of the enforcement that would have to take place. The driver fees, currently taxi cab and livery drivers are required to pay a $50 licensing fee, and we're recommending a $35 fee for peer-to-peer drivers, but we will go back and reduce that fee to $35 across the board for all for-hire drivers. There's an application fee that's $10 across the board that all applicants are required to pay. The background check, they're required to do a BCI background check through the license section at $32. All drivers will be required to pay that same fee. You can obtain your driver abstract from the BMV, which is approximately about $8, so they'll be required to pay that to the BMV and bring us an updated copy. Other fees, taxi cab operators or owners obviously have to pay a $31 taxi meter fee. There are no additional fees for liveries and peer-to-peer, and the reinspection fee of $25 across the board. And what that reinspection fee is put in place so that people come to their inspections prepared. Obviously, as part of their licensing, we do that first inspection as part of their fees, but as we go on and find things, we want them to come prepared, so we charge a reinspection fee. The vehicle standards, all vehicles are required the 3-door minimum, and some may ask, that seems kind of silly, a 3-door minimum, but that includes some of the older minivans that may not have transitioned to the 4 doors yet. So over time, that will change to a 4-door minimum, but right now, we stuck with the 3-door to include those. The age limit on the vehicle, we're proposing a 10-year age limit on peer-to-peer. Currently, for taxi cabs, we're working on a phased-in approach. Last year, we realized that a great majority of the fleet were significantly older than that 8-year age limit, so we're working on a phased-in approach, and we will get them down to 8 years. But the Vehicle for Hire Board is working on some rules that would allow for a 2-year exception for green vehicles. And currently, our liveries are at 8 years, which they have been for quite some time. So it should be somewhat consistent once the green vehicles go into place. The ASC certified inspection, all will be required to do that, and that's required by a third party. And we do that so that there's no vested interest in the vehicle. The one exception we did take out in this proposed legislation is allowing them to contract with a garage. Obviously, the garage can't be the owner of one of their vehicles or something like that, but we realize that it would be much easier to have a contract with a garage that you trust to do your inspections for you. So we are taking out that requirement, and we'll go back and do the same thing for taxis and liveries. The display decal, taxis and liveries are required to have a decal showing that they are licensed by the city, and that's on all four sides of the vehicle. And this is something we had a lot of discussion about on the peer-to-peer side. I realize that these companies do not want decals on the vehicles, but we feel it's imperative for enforcement reasons. As our police officers, if they pull over one of these vehicles, they should know it's a for-hire vehicle, because obviously there are some standards that must be met. So the compromise was coming up with a temporary decal, because we realize some of their drivers are going to be a casual pool of drivers and may only drive 3 or 4 times a month in this capacity. So they have the ability to put that decal in the window when they're operating as a for-hire vehicle, but take it out on their daily commutes to work. So we're working on a temporary decal for them. The trade dress, which is typically on your taxi cabs, the name of the cab, the phone number, we do require that for cabs. We are not requiring that for liveries, nor do we require it for peer-to-peer. The driver standards, the age, in the past, we've always had an age limit of 18 years old for taxis and liveries. We will be increasing that to 21, along with what we're proposing for peer-to-peer. We realize that most of the taxi cab companies can't insure anybody under the age of 23 to 25, so we felt it was more appropriate to increase that age limit. Now, who this does impact is pedicab operators, so we will stick with an 18-year-old age limit for pedicabs, but increase those driving an actual vehicle to 21. The BCI background check, consistent across the board. They're all required to do the BCI background and for the 7-year look-back period. The driver abstract, 8 or more points in 3 years. If you have more than that, you cannot obtain a license, so it's consistent across the board on the requirement. Currently, we have a physical requirement for all of our vehicle for hire drivers, and we are not going to require that for peer-to-peer drivers. So what we will do is go back and remove that out of the vehicle for hire driver code. And obviously, this led to a great deal of discussion back and forth about physicals. And the compromise to this was on the application, we will have a list of ailments, so to say, that they will be required to sign an affidavit that they do not have any of these health conditions. And obviously, if they do mark yes, that could potentially lead to requiring a physical. So we'll continue to work with the industry and inform them of what we're looking to change on the application for that. Driving experience, all drivers are required to have a minimum of 6 months driving experience. And finally, dispatching, the ability to hail. Obviously, taxi cabs can be hailed on the street, through dispatch, or through an app. Liveries must be through contract, dispatch, or through an app through prearrangement. They're not allowed to accept street hails. Same with peer-to-peer. They can only accept rides through the online application, no street hails. In the last 2 areas, records. This is basically just what their record retentions will be. They're required to maintain vehicle information, trip sheets, keep them all for 6 months, and when a complaint arises or a need to investigate a driver, they do need to provide those records to us upon request. And the fare rates, I just put these in here more for education. They're all taximeters are used for taxi cabs. Liveries, it's either an hourly rate, or if they're being used through an app, there's going to be a per mile per minute rate. And then obviously peer-to-peer is all done through the mobile app with a per mile per minute rate. The insurance requirements, obviously this has been the sticking point through creating all of this legislation. So what we require from other for-hire vehicles, we require a commercial policy for each licensed vehicle. The policy covers the driver, the passengers, and any third party. So the coverage for taxi cabs is $300,000, liveries $500,000, pedicabs $300,000, and horse carriage is $300,000. So as we started doing the peer-to-peer insurance requirements, obviously we are not experts at insurance, so we sought some outside help with Demotech. We were very fortunate they stepped up to help us work through the insurance requirements. So I'm going to go through what we're requiring and then ask him to talk about some of the gaps. We made a request for Uber's insurance policy, and they were generous enough to supply us with the original policy, but but we do not have the contingent policy to review, but we have a general idea of what it says. We did make a request for list policy to review as well, and we have not gotten that yet, but they will be required to provide that as part of their licensing process. So some of the requirements, the policy must meet the following. It must be current and valid, issued by an insurance company that is admitted to do business in the state of Ohio, or by an eligible surplus lines or risk retention group that has a credit rating of no less than A- from AM Best or an A from Demotech. Act as a primary and drop down and pay the first dollar of a claim when the driver's personal motor vehicle insurance policy fails to cover any portion of the claim for any reason, and requires that these companies notify the license section within 10 days after a claim is made against a policy. The policy must also provide the following minimum coverage for each associated driver of the peer-to-peer company and vehicle from the time the driver accepts a trip request until the completion of a trip. So not less than $1 million in liability coverage per incident, not less than $1 million in uninsured and underinsured per incident, not less than $25,000 in comprehensive and collision coverage per accident for property damage, and not less than $50,000 per person, and not less than $100,000 per accident for medical expenses. The policy must also require a contingent policy that provides the following minimum coverage for each associated driver and vehicle when the driver is logged on to the online application and available for hire. Liability coverage with not less than $50,000 per person and not less than $100,000 per incident for bodily injury and $25,000 for property damage, not less than $25,000 in comprehensive and collision, and not less than $50,000 per person and not less than $100,000 per accident for medical expenses. Now, the one that I did leave off here that we're still working through is the underinsured and uninsured. Obviously, working with Demotech, we had them review the policy and spell out where the gaps were at. Based on their review of Uber's policy, it appears that the driver tends to be left uncovered if they're at fault. And so we're trying to fill those gaps. You know, obviously, with taxi cabs and liveries and pedicabs, the drivers, the passengers, and the third party are covered at all times, so there's no different level of coverage. So we felt it was important to include those, to cover that driver as part of this, because we realized that most of these drivers have exclusions in their personal automobile policy that does not allow them to operate in a commercial capacity. So most likely their insurance company will deny that claim. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hand it over to Bert Coleman with Demotech and have him go through their review of the policy.
Before you begin, Burke, I'd like to publicly recognize you and your company for the work that they've done on this issue, and thank you for the service. You have no skin in this game. You don't represent Uber or Lyft or any peer-to-peer company. It's just you're doing a public service to the city of Columbus by providing this analysis, and I wanted to thank you and your team for doing that.
Sure. I'm Bert Coleman. I'm the legal counsel for Demotech Incorporated. Just so everyone's aware, Demotech is located in Dublin, Ohio. We're an actuarial consulting and financial analysis firm. We specialize in providing financial stability ratings to title underwriters and property and casualty insurance companies. We currently rate over 400 insurance companies, including over 30 that are domiciled in Ohio and over 100 that are currently doing business in Ohio. And we've been pleased to serve as a resource to the City of Columbus and to the Department of Public Safety on some of these insurance issues. We've had a chance to review Uber's policy. That's the insurance policy that is in effect to cover a driver after they've accepted a ride and are either en route to pick up a passenger or transporting a passenger. We've also seen the certificate of coverage that Uber has in place for the contingent liability policy that Amanda had discussed. We have not seen the actual policy, so my comments may make some assumptions about what that policy includes, but again, we haven't seen the specific details on that one.
And before you, again,
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt, I think it's important to note that the City of Columbus can set the standards of what the insurance policy will be required to meet, and that the City of Columbus would not issue a license to any peer-to-peer company without seeing that those standards are met via the insurance policy. So I know you're making assumptions, but the assumptions will actually be, to some degree, memorialized in the legislation. And if the legislation language is not met by the actual insurance coverage, then the license won't be issued. So I just wanted to make that clear to people that are listening, that you're just not making assumptions and we're just going to assume that they're true. You're making assumptions, and then those assumptions will be based into the code, and then therefore the peer-to-peer company would not be granted a license to operate in the city of Columbus unless those requirements were met. So please proceed.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make a couple observations here about what Uber's policy that we've reviewed does cover and where some potential gaps may be. The gaps I'm discussing could also be referred to as differences between the Uber policy and the proposed legislation, or maybe gaps between what Uber's policies are covering and what maybe the fullest personal auto policy might cover. The $1 million liability policy that Uber currently has in place obviously provides $1 million of liability coverage. That's going to cover passengers and also third parties, pedestrians, other drivers. There's also the $1 million of coverage for uninsured, underinsured. That's going to cover the driver and the passengers, and we'll cover them when another driver is at fault and if they're uninsured or underinsured. That $1 million policy applies, again, only when the driver is actively providing the T&C services, that is, en route to pick up a passenger or transporting a passenger. The contingent policy, with limits of $50,000 per person for bodily injury, $100,000 per accident, and $25,000 for property damage, is a liability policy. That's going to cover the pre-trip period, and that would apply when a driver is logged into the application available for hire, but is not accepted a ride. So that's the difference between those two policies. The potential gaps that arise between the policies that are currently in place and the proposed legislation, under the $1 million policy, a driver's personal auto policy potentially could exclude coverage when a driver is providing the T&C services, in which case the driver could lose his liability coverage, medical payments coverage, comprehensive and collision coverage, and uninsured, underinsured coverage that they might have under their personal auto policy that would apply at all other times, but coverage for those specific coverages would be excluded when the driver's providing the services, or potentially even when the driver's simply logged in and available for hire. So under the $1 million policy, you could see a driver that may end up with no medical payments coverage. MedPay coverage applies regardless of fault. It's not intended to replace health insurance, but it steps in to cover the medical expenses for drivers and passengers in an automobile. Comprehensive and collision.
Bert,
sure.
Just so I understand what you're saying, you're telling or suggesting, based on your review of the policy, that there is a gap for medical expenses for the driver of the peer-to-peer car. Everyone else should be covered in the case of an accident, but the driver, him or herself, may have some questions of whether the driver would be covered for medical expenses under the $1 million policy. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Correct. Under the $1 million policy, the $1 million of liability coverage is going to cover the passenger, and the uninsured, underinsured coverage is also going to cover the passenger and the driver in that instance. However, if the driver is at fault...
I see. So the driver of the peer-to-peer car is at fault.
Assuming the driver is at fault and they don't have access to a third party's liability coverage or the UIM coverage, they're not going to have access to any MedPay coverage that they might have, or potentially they might not, depending on the exclusion in the underlying policy. They may not have access to any medical payments coverage that they have under their personal auto policy.
So they could rely on personal health insurance coverage?
They could.
Okay.
But medical payments coverage, again, is not intended to replace health insurance. I think you'll see in a typical personal auto policy limits of $5,000. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's in place. It can cover co-pays, it can cover deductibles. It operates slightly different than health insurance would, and obviously it's provided through the auto carrier and not a health insurer.
So a potential solution, and this is more of like a Band-Aid approach, but yet I think could potentially address this issue, would be the fact that if the driver had personal health insurance, that would essentially, I know it was not intended to replace, but at least that would be, from a driver's point of view, operating the vehicle, the driver's at fault of the peer-to-peer company, there's bodily injury, and that person needs to go to the hospital, and there's medical bills. Clearly, you're stating the $1 million policy isn't going to step into place, but the person's personal health insurance could cover it.
Correct.
Okay.
There might be some stipulations in the driver's personal health insurance. I can't comment on the scope of the coverage there,
Sure.
but presumably there would be some coverage for their bodily injuries from their own health insurance.
Okay, thank you.
So under both policies, the $1 million policy and the contingent policy with differing limits, the gaps are generally going to apply to the driver. Of course, the passenger would also have access to any available medical payments coverage that was not otherwise excluded. MedPay coverage generally covers both the driver and the passengers of the vehicle. But under both policies, the driver is also, there's a potential that their personal auto policy could exclude coverage for comprehensive coverage and collision coverage, which are both dealing with physical damage to the driver's vehicle. Again, if a third party is at fault, a third-party driver is at fault, the driver can potentially recover from their insurance company to repair the driver's own vehicle. But again, if the driver's at fault or if there's not enough coverage there, the lack of comp and collision because of this potential exclusion could leave the driver without the ability or without insurance to cover repairs to their vehicle. And finally, under the contingent liability policy, there's also no mention of uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage, which, again, if the driver is logged into the application available for hire, not necessarily providing the services, not having accepted a ride, and a third-party driver is responsible for the accident, the driver's recovery is going to be limited to simply the limits of insurance that the third-party driver has, which could be state minimum. It could be nothing if it's an uninsured driver, and they're not necessarily going to have access to their uninsured, underinsured coverage under their personal auto policy if there's an exclusion to make up the difference there.
I know that the pre-trip period has been one of significant discussion, not just in the city of Columbus, but nationally, and really whether one deems the pre-trip period, so the pre-trip period, for those that are listening and may not know what that means, it's you're driving logged onto the app, but have not accepted a ride and no one's riding in your car. So you're essentially driving around logged onto the application. Of whether that's commercial activity simply because you're logged on to the app. Clearly some insurance companies have deemed that it's not. I think that the evidence of that is in San Francisco, where there was the tragic accident of the driver who struck a child and I believe killed the child. The person was logged onto the app, but no one was in the car. And the driver's personal automobile coverage did cover that. So clearly that insurance company, whoever it was, believed that was not commercial activity, or at least it wasn't excluded from the policy. That doesn't mean that there's going to be insurance companies that do deem it commercial activity. So clearly it's a question that insurance companies sounds like they're tackling, and some may deem it commercial, some may not, some may create policies. I'm guessing if there's a market out for this, and clearly there is based on drivers that are here in the audience. Go ahead, Bryce. It looks like you want to say something.
I just wanted to comment that the gaps and the potential differences in coverage are highly contingent on the driver's underlying personal auto coverage. To your point, some will exclude coverage whenever a driver is available for hire. Others, the language is while carrying persons for a fee. So there's a difference. There's certainly differences in the personal auto policies, and the gaps that I was referring to are all potentials, and they could arise, but they're dependent on what the driver's personal auto policy.
From a government perspective and from a regulation perspective, I'm primarily concerned about passengers And so from what I hear you saying, that in all circumstances, it appears that passengers are covered. There's no gaps with passengers in the vehicle in the peer-to-peer company.
Correct. I'm hard-pressed to think of a scenario where, under the $1 million policy, there's a passenger in the car, and either the driver is not at fault or a third-party driver with the benefit of the UIM coverage or the third party's liability coverage would not cover the injured passenger.
Because that's my primary responsibility, is ensuring that folks that are members of the City of Columbus that are visiting the City of Columbus and they get in a peer-to-peer company or they get into a taxi cab or a livery vehicle, if in the unfortunate event of an accident, will there be coverage? And it sounds like that under the proposed scheme, there will be coverage for the passenger. There appears, conversely, that there could be some gaps for the driver. I think from that perspective, my personal point of view, it's interesting that while the city should be concerned about the driver, and we certainly are, which is why we have criteria proposed to make sure the driver is licensed, there is a little bit of assumption of the risk of engaging in this activity. And I know that in talking with the Department of Public Safety and putting the driver on notice that your personal insurer may not cover you in the event of an accident, just so that they're on notice that this is something they should work out with their own personal insurance company. But my primary concern is for the driver. Do you have any other, for the passenger. Do you have any other comments on this issue, sir?
I do not, unless you have any other questions for me.
No, not at this time, but stand by. We may have questions that
Sure.
come up. And again, let me thank you and Demotech for the services that you provided in this instance. Ms. Ford?
Great, we're almost done. One more area that I want to quickly cover are the online application requirements. I think this is always important for people to understand what they're going to get from these companies. So the app must display the following. When you agree to a ride, they must send you a message with the driver's first name, picture, and their city-issued license number. This was a compromise as part of displaying their driver license that's issued from the city in the vehicle, like we require for taxi cabs. So it will help us when we look in and we see that driver, we can see their city-issued number next to it. And all the passengers get an emailed receipt with that information in it as well. So they have to provide a picture and/or the make, model, and the license plate of the vehicle, the ability to contact the available driver to determine if the vehicle can accommodate an individual with disabilities, electronic notifications of all fees charged to the passenger's credit card, and a platform for allowing drivers and passengers to rate one another, ensuring that ratings are not based on unlawful discrimination. The website and app must display the fare rate schedule and all fees a passenger may be charged, that the app facilitates rides with drivers using personal vehicles, the insurance requirements, phone numbers, and emails for the company and for the license section for the purposes of complaints. And then most importantly, the no limitation of liability in the terms of services. We felt this was important to include because we know, as most consumers don't read the fine print. I know I'm guilty of it myself. So we found that agreeing to the terms of service in both Uber and Lyft's in their terms of agreement preclude the company from any liability if something were to happen. So we wrote in a clause that states the company cannot use its terms of services to evade any insurance requirements or liability from injuries, damages, or other loss arising from actions or inactions of the company and/or driver. So this is just kind of a consumer protection issue that's built into that, just so that they can't attempt to limit their liability. So just a quick summary of the legislation. The peer-to-peer companies all must obtain a license. So they must maintain and meet our insurance requirements, preserve proper records, may not provide access to a peer-to-peer driver until the driver is properly licensed, and cooperate with the director in the case of any customer complaints. It requires all drivers to obtain a license. They must go through a BCI background check and meet the standards. They must get a BMV driver abstract, a signed affidavit regarding their medical history, an independent third-party vehicle mechanical inspection, proof of state minimum automobile insurance, and meet driver standards. So a few that they'll have to meet is obviously maintaining a clean vehicle, not operating a vehicle under the influence of drugs or alcohol, no texting or talking on their phone while a passenger is in the vehicle, and they may not accept street hails. So these are just a few that I pulled out of the overall code. So that is it for our presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Ford and Director Brown, for the presentation. We do have speakers. If you want to sign up for a speaker slip and you have not done so already, you can, over there, John, still over there? Okay, outside, you can sign them up and hand them to John right here. Our first speaker is Jim Black of Lyft. Oh, I'm sorry.
One moment.
Sorry, Jim.
Sorry, Jim, you can come on up. You can come on up. I just quickly wanted to introduce Tom Ibenson. He's our license manager. So I'm not certain you've had an opportunity to meet him, so we asked him to be with us here today, since I know in the end he will be handling the licensing of all this.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate you coming. Jim. If you just could identify yourself, any organizations you represent, and then you have 3 minutes.
All right, I'm Jim Black. I'm Executive Vice President at Lyft. One, I want to say thank you to you, Chairman Klein, and to the members of the Public Safety Committee. We've worked very hard on this, and I think we've come a long way. And we're just about there, and I'm very happy about that. I think I've said before, Lyft's vision is to provide a safe and enjoyable way to fill up the empty seats on the road. 20% of the seats are full at this point, and we're trying to raise that. If we could take that 20 to 25, we could take up to 25% of the cars off the road. Safety is a very strong part of Lyft's DNA. We do criminal background checks, have always been going back at least 7 years, driving record checks, the 19-point inspection, GPS tracking of each and every ride, zero tolerance drug and alcohol policy, life support, a rating system, and $1 million commercial liability insurance policy, which is very similar to what was described here. By filling the empty seats, there are quite a few advantages, from reducing congestion and greenhouse gases to reducing the need for parking, serving all areas of the city, reducing drunk driving, increasing social fabric, and even last mile options for public transportation. But we can only do this if we can recruit not just full-time drivers and people who will go through quite a few hoops, but casual drivers as well, people who will provide occasional rides in their own neighborhoods, to neighbors, to the elderly, to those who need short rides to the store or maybe a quick ride home after an evening out. Those drivers are me, those drivers are you, those drivers are all of us in this room. And this can't be done, however, if drivers are really required to take burdensome and sometimes unnecessary measures to be able to drive for their neighbors. The cost will far outweigh the benefit, and you simply won't get them. And I have to say we've come a long, long way, and I think we're very, very close. And I'm, again, thank you for all the work that's gone on. But certain things, do still make it difficult. Vehicle age limits that, based on mileage, would be equivalent to 2 years in a cab. Trips to the Public Safety Committee for fingerprints and photographs, at least I believe it's hard to tell exactly what it would take, but just things that will cause you, me, and others to take a half a day off of work, go and apply for this, are really going to limit, the casual riders. Inspections by only certain mechanics, rather than either a company representative or somebody who isn't necessarily an ASC mechanic. I think most people take their cars to get worked on and do far greater operations with mechanics that are not necessarily ASC. ASC is not a state license requirement, it's just a trade association that gives out a certain kind of certification. And not all mechanics even apply for it. We've talked about the insurance, and from what I'm hearing today, I think we're just about there. We're very, very close on the insurance. Lyft does have, insurance that was similar to what was described just now.
And I want to give you an opportunity to finish, sir. Please finish.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and the policies that we do have been reviewed and approved and are used in California, Washington, D.C., Indianapolis, St. Paul, Colorado, and other jurisdictions where they've actually reviewed them, approved them, we've gone ahead with them. And there are other jurisdictions as well that are writing exactly what it is into it. So, I appreciate the work. I think we've set up an application review process that will get people in. We can have those advantages and those benefits. And that's it. I just want to say thank you very much for what
Sure, and thank you, Mr. Black, for coming from California to be here today. You mentioned a other jurisdictions on the insurance front. Are those jurisdictions that you identified that currently accept the $1 million and then the contingent for the trip and then pre-trip as the contingent, the 50, 125?
Yes, yes. In fact, California originally, had approved the $1 million policy without the contingent policy. In fact, there is coverage during that, what I'd call the pre-match period, when the application is on. People are often at home, people are often going to the drugstore, they're casual drivers. The whole idea is they're out doing other things, they can give a ride while they're doing that. Before they're matched, they're not necessarily, it's not a commercial activity, and that's, as you mentioned, with the one accident with the insurer that picked it up, we haven't had an incident of insurance companies denying coverage during that period. So it wasn't an issue, but it came up a lot at meetings like this. It came up, from incumbent organizations that pointed to that period and said that could be a problem. So we came up with the contingent policy. So if ever there is a gap there, the contingent policy steps in.
What were those jurisdictions? Because I think it's important to note that, the determination that, at least my determination, that what's being proposed, the $1 million with the contingency, is a fair and reasonable coverage, is that Columbus isn't on an island
Right.
Accepting this, and then other jurisdictions require perhaps more or less insurance, that in the research and in conversations of working with folks in the insurance industry and working with public safety and working with peer-to-peer industry, that these limits are very similar or the same limits as other jurisdictions. So Columbus would be joining other jurisdictions that provide or require those levels of insurance.
Right.
And what were those jurisdictions again?
California, written right into the statewide Public Utilities Commission regulations, or the ruling. It'll be written into regulations shortly. Washington D.C. both with their emergency ordinance, together with what is has been proposed by Council members Shea and Grasso now for the permanent regulations. Indianapolis, St. Paul, both reviewed the policy. They don't have an ordinance that goes up, but they have approved, what we had. And again, this was before that, the contingent coverage. The contingent coverage was something in addition to that. And Colorado's new statute, I believe there may be, one or two others as well that, that are actually working it into it. So it certainly wouldn't be an island.
Is there anything that Demotech said in their review, because I know you were sitting in the back listening, that you disagreed with?
The idea of, I wouldn't say I disagreed, it was just something that I would add to it, and that is collision and collision and comprehensive. It's something that we provide, but it is really something that I'm surprised, I would be surprised to see that actually in an ordinance or in a law. Insurance companies themselves, when we met with some very large automotive insurers, they recommend that people not get collision coverage after the car is a certain age, and that age is much, it's a much younger age than you would think. At a certain point, collision coverage, comprehensive coverage, is always optional. Do you want to get collision coverage? Maybe not, depending upon your car. Do you want to get comprehensive? Do you really care about that pebble that cracks the windshield? That's the kind of thing that comprehensive coverage is covering. It's not covering your liability. It's not covering, there's no public safety aspect to that. So that was one thing that, I heard the discussion, but I just think it's important to realize that that's a coverage that I've never seen in any other, vehicle for hire regulation, nor is it required for any personal driver. It's, you would never require that somebody out there get comprehensive or get collision coverage for their own car.
What about the idea of the driver not being covered for bodily injury and medical payments? What's Lyft's position or comment about that?
The drivers, would be covered in, I believe, I haven't done exhaustive research. I know some people have it. I think the drivers are covered by their medical coverage. The bodily injury coverage for for automobile, what you would get, again, that too is usually optional. But when you get it, it's not very much at all. It's a very small amount, and it's really providing things like the deductibles and those kinds of coverages. It's not something where if you had a devastating injury, I mean, it's often as little as $5,000 or something, something like that. It's not designed for, the major industry. It's almost more of a convenience.
Okay. I want to give the director or the city attorney an opportunity if they have any questions for Mr. Black. Okay, thank you, Mr. Black.
Thank you very much.
I was remiss also, I was planning on calling up a vehicle for hire board representative who also happens to be in the leadership at Experience Columbus, Mike Brown. Thank you, Mr. Brown. You're familiar with the drill at council.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Klein, Chair of this committee, City Attorney Mr. Pfeiffer. I'm Mike Brown. I represent Experience Columbus, but also, as you said, you have appointed us to serve as part of the Vehicle for Hire Board, and we appreciate that. As we see it, we try to look at everything through the eyes of the visitors, and whether I think of my own parents and grandparents coming down to Columbus or people coming in for all the conventions and sporting events, clean, safe, convenient transportation is one of the top issues that we face, and it's a real challenge. So we appreciate that the city is taking a solid look at this and that the focus is on safety. I think that's really come through in the debates, all the hearings that have been held, the meetings we've held at the Vehicle for Hire Commission, but also here today. Safety is really number one. We've got a really strong fleet of cabs in this town that we use a lot, and seeing Uber, Lyft, and others start to enter this market, along with some of the other elements that are coming in with bike shares and car-to-go, that's exciting for Columbus, and it is a change. So while we market that outside, the message at the end of the day is how do we have that clean, safe ride for everybody? It benefits visitors, benefits residents. At the end of the day, that helps us lift up the whole economy. So we appreciate it. We are in support of the changes overall as a group. Experience Columbus has taken a look at it, and so we really want to know how we can be a resource as this system comes together and as we look at moving people easily as part of our sale in the future, how we keep doing this and increasing our public transit options. I think there was a big debate about that at the Metropolitan Club just today. These are good questions for Columbus to face, and we appreciate and applaud the city for your leadership on it.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you. Our next speaker is Catherine Beach Dean. Welcome to council. If you just could identify yourself. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone stood up. Oh, you have a speaker slip. Oh, feel free to give it to John. I'm sorry. Yeah, just go ahead and bring it up to give it to John. If you have identify yourself, any organizations you represent, you have 3 minutes.
I'm Catherine Beach Dean, and I work for Lyft, and I'd like to thank the council and Councilmember Klein for the opportunity to speak today. I have allergies, so I apologize for my voice. I'm a driver for the ride-sharing peer-to-peer company Lyft, and I've been driving for Lyft since March of 2014. And I want to share with the council some of the highlights of my experiences and the feedback that I've received from my passengers, the fellow citizens of my community. I've had hundreds of passengers in my vehicle, and they have all remarked how much they love having the option to use alternative transportation in Columbus. I've been told how unsafe they feel riding in cabs and how disrespectfully they've been treated. And all have commented that Lyft and its competitor Uber have been really wonderful in filling the demand for alternative, safe, friendly, and yes, even fun transportation. There's a great demand and need in our city from many underserved members of our community. Many disabled passengers tell me horror stories of their experiences trying to just make simple arrangements to get to a doctor's appointment or even to work. I and my fellow drivers provide a reliable, safe, timely, and friendly way to get to where they need to go. And to quote one of my passengers, "I love Lyft because you guys treat me like I'm a human being." That says a lot to me, that people in my community, my neighbors, don't have a car and they have to rely on some sort of transportation, and that they tell me they feel safe riding with me and they are comfortable and they're happy, and we're fulfilling a very important need in this community. Not only that, it also provides jobs for people who are not able to get employment with traditional means right now. people who have some disabilities or physical limitations, like not being able to stand for 8 hours a day or needing to take frequent breaks, being able to drive for a peer-to-peer company, you can work the hours that you need to. You can be a casual driver like Jim mentioned. That's very important, and it fulfills a big need in our community. My own experiences driving for Lyft, I have gained a lot of new confidence and financial security, and it's been really nice to see new parts of my community and also to get to meet new people, talking with them and helping them get where they need to go. Peer-to-peer ride-sharing is a win-win for Columbus and its citizens. The community of passengers love the services we provide and the sense of community we instill and the friendly welcome that they receive every time they take a ride. The drivers for these companies are able to earn a living doing something very rewarding, both financially and also on a personal level. Columbus can only continue to benefit from peer-to-peer ride-sharing, and I hope that it will remain a part of our community. I think the regulations that are being proposed are amenable, and they are something that as a driver I would be open to and accept and think that they sound great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ann Lutz. I'm sorry, it's Annette, not Ann. I don't know how I missed the 2 T's and the E. Sorry. If you could just identify your name, your address, any organizations you represent, and you have 3 minutes.
Okay, my name's Annette Lutz, and I am just a resident here in Columbus. I'm a blind small business owner who has lived in Columbus for most of my life. Obviously, I don't drive. So getting around this city of ours has always been a challenge until the recent introduction of Lyft and Uber. Now I feel a freedom that I haven't before experienced. Due to my limited mobility skills, I am unable to use CODA's fixed route services independently, leaving only their paratransit service, Project Mainstream, and taxis as my sole source of transportation. Though Project Mainstream is fairly reliable for planned trips where a longer stay is intended, such as work, there are rules of having to schedule trips at least 24 hours in advance and having to stay somewhere for at least 2 hours make short errands and impulse trips impossible. Taxis, on the other hand, are even less reliable. Though fairly responsive downtown and at the airport, they are a challenge to get into the neighborhoods, particularly for short trips. I have personally waited over 2 hours on many occasions for a cab, and at times they've never showed up at all, leaving me stranded with no ride home. Also, I have great concern about the safety of cabs, where many drivers spend the entire trip talking on their cell phones or handling dispatch duties while driving. None of these concerns have ever been present with Lyft or Uber. I'm going to tell you an example of a trip that I've taken with Lyft recently. I was able to take my daughter out for ice cream, something that I've never been able to do before independently until these became available to me. In the past, it would be a several-hour all-day event. By using Lyft, we went to Graders and were gone about an hour. With Project Mainstream, I would have had to decide to go at least 24 hours in advance, not on the spur of the moment, like most people would go for such a trip, and would have had to be gone a minimum of 2 hours. I would not have even tried such an unnecessary trip with a taxi because of my fear of not knowing if and when one would ever come to bring me home. This is just one example of how services like Lyft have given me the freedom and independence that I've never had before. I am now able to go such everyday places independently, like the bank, the grocery store, and even to pick up food through a drive-through window, like any sighted driver citizen can do. Though I have only been able to experience this freedom for the few months these services have been around, it would be personally devastating to me and my family to lose it now. As I have said, I've lived in Columbus my entire life. I was raised by blind parents and have a blind husband, so I have never known the luxury of having my own car or being able to come and go as I please. Lyft and Uber have brought me as close to this reality as I probably ever will be. It truly is the next best thing to driving myself. I ask that council not overregulate these services, allow them to continue, and allow them to provide the services that I've become able to rely on all this time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ms. Lutz. Appreciate you coming down to council. I'm sorry, that was very moving testimony, but there's no applause in chambers. Sorry. The next speaker is Eric Duffy. Mr. Duffy, welcome to council. If you could identify your name, your address, any organizations you represent, and you, sir, also have 3 minutes.
Councilman Klein, members of the Public Safety Department, I want to thank you for your work in this area. My name is Eric Duffy. I live at 48 West Longview in Columbus. I am the president of the National Federation of the Blind of Ohio. I'll take credit for being the first one to tell Annette about Lyft and Uber, and so I got a credit for a free ride from each of those companies when she used my code. So, and you know, I want to tell you that 74% of blind people today are unemployed or underemployed. And you can say, what does this have to do with peer-to-peer transportation? Well, on one hand, nothing, and on the other hand, everything. For the first time in my life, I have been unemployed for almost a month. But I still need a reliable, safe, affordable means of transportation. So I've come to rely on Lyft and Uber quite extensively. It is far more convenient than the services offered by CODA, whether it's the paratransit mainstream or the other service, UTS. If I need to go to a doctor's appointment, an employment interview, or something else, I can do it quickly, easily, and know when my ride is going to be there, both to take me to the appointment and to bring me home. I used to rely on taxis quite heavily. My last experience with that, I was coming home from Washington, D.C. I was at the airport, and I told the worker at the airport who showed me to a taxi that I needed to have a taxi that takes credit cards. He assured me that the taxi that I was getting into took a credit card. About halfway home, the driver says, I hope you have enough change for something, whatever he said, and I said, well, I intended to pay by credit card. The driver said, I don't take a credit card. So I had to go about 10 o'clock at night to an ATM machine, get cash. I was charged for that trip to the ATM machine so I could pay the driver. That was not money I planned to spend. So there are many ways in which these peer-to-peer transportation services are very convenient to me, to others with disabilities, and to the citizens of Columbus. I believe it will help our city grow. And it is clear that council is looking at these services as services that are here to stay. So I guess the next part of that would be to say, also, let's do what we can to keep them affordable to the customers. Let's not regulate to such a degree that they become every bit as expensive as taxi and other services. And safety is important. All those things we've talked about today are important. I don't underestimate that, but so is affordability. And that's something we need to keep in mind. As Annette said, this is probably the closest experience I will ever have to being able to drive because this service is on demand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy. Because you did mention credit cards and cabs, I'd like to give Ms. Ford the opportunity to at least tell Mr. Duffy and the viewing audience what the standard is for credit cards and cabs.
Last year, when we were rewriting the codes as it related to vehicle for hire owners and drivers, all cabs are required to have a credit card reader in the back of their vehicle by the end of June. So a couple months ago, I met with some taxi representatives, and I was assured that this deadline could be met. So as part of their inspection process, we will be making sure and enforcing that piece of the code to make sure they do
Thank
the
you.
correct.
And also, Mr. Duffy, you mentioned regulation. It's always been my belief as a member of council that we should have as much regulation as needed, but at the same time, as little regulation is needed to effectuate the purpose and the change that we're looking to govern with. So what I mean by that is we shouldn't over-regulate, but we should have enough as necessary to protect the public, and I believe that this legislation is headed in that direction. The next speaker is Cassie Deola. Deola. So if you just could state your name and your address, any organizations you represent.
All right. My name's Cassie Deala. I live at 5508 Buenos Aires Boulevard in Westerville, and I am a driver also for Lyft. And I want to reiterate a little bit of what Katie said, that what our I've now given over 300 lifts to passengers. I started the second week that Lyft was in Columbus. And so I've had quite a bit of experience with our passengers, many of them repeat passengers. And all of them are just very much enthusiastic about Lyft being here and appreciative. And I've had a number of stories as well where they don't like the cab experience. And so I think having this competition here, as was mentioned earlier, it's going to make everybody step up and improve the quality. And so competition is not a bad thing in this area. I also want to speak to the safety aspect from the driver's perspective. So when all of this came up, I was surprised that we were concerned from a safety aspect because of everything that we had to go through in order to get approved as a driver with the background check, the vehicle inspections, and things like that. But from a personal safety perspective, the fact that we can see a photo of our passengers and that we can identify our passengers, that we know who they are and they know who we are. They can see our photos, they can see what car that we're driving, they have our license plate. So if there is an incident, we have a trail to follow in order to track that back to that passenger if there is something that happens. We also have a protocol in place if there's an item that's left in the car. And so that we have a protocol for getting that back to the passenger. We can call our support line, and the passenger can call our support line as well, so that we make sure any items left behind can get back to the passenger. So those are the kinds of things that I appreciate about Lyft. I do have some concerns about the driver fees that you've proposed. I'm a single mom of 7 children, and I have 4 at home still. So some of those fees would be cost prohibitive for me and for a lot of our drivers, I think, particularly our part-time drivers. The advantage of Lyft is that we can be a driver for Lyft while we're doing other things and not make this a full-time position. And I do happen to make it full-time for myself, but we have a number of drivers that don't. And so having those fees could be prohibitive for a lot of our drivers. Thank you.
Yeah, question?
Thank you.
One question.
City Attorney has a
Ma'am,
question.
one question, please? You indicated that you could see the picture of the passenger you might pick up, correct?
Yes.
Have you ever refused to pick up a passenger based upon the person you saw in the picture?
Oh, heavens no.
Have you ever known any Lyft drivers to refuse to pick up a passenger because of the picture that they see in the screen?
I have not heard that at all.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Philip Gasparich. I'm sorry? Okay. Well, in good company with everyone else. If you just could, again, name, address, any organizations you represent, 3 minutes.
My name is Philip Gasparich. My address is 1813 Spruce Drive, Columbus, Ohio. I am a driver for Lyft. I am one of those, as they've mentioned, the casual drivers. I've been driving since about middle of April. I only have done 70 rides, but as they've all said, Lyft is a big thing. I have not had any experience with Uber as of yet, but the whole peer-to-peer, I'm loving every bit of it. You get to find out more about your city. I've found so much more about High Street that I didn't even know existed. And I'm just, again, with all of what they've been saying, yes, I see the regulation need. Yes, I see public safety need. But at the same time, I'm hoping that there's not going to be so many fees that I'm a casual driver. I don't want to start, having to put all my money that I make from the company back into having all the fees. So I just hope that there won't be much of the regulation, but at the same time, we do need to regulate. We do need to have our public in mind and the safety of everyone. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for coming down. Next speaker is Nicholas Bryan. Name, address, organizations, 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Bryan. I live at 8465 Reynoldswood Drive in Reynoldsburg. I'm a Lyft driver. I live out in the suburbs, so I actually work downtown doing sales and marketing. So Lyft has been able to open me to kill some downtime, basically, just pick up some passengers, meet some new people, and give some awesome rides to some amazing people. I've given 2 Lyfts to Annette and her family, which has been very inspirational for me because I went 15 minutes out of my way to pick them up, to take them half a mile down the road. So, and I just made sure that they were safe, made sure that they got in and out of the vehicle as well too. So, safety is always my concern as a driver. I drive my own personal vehicle as well as the other drivers. As I drive a 2014 Ford Escape, so I want to make sure my vehicle stays in good condition because it's my own personal vehicle. So safety is always our biggest concern. A few comments that passengers have left me, I just wanted to pass along. We are a very great and flexible company. Nick was super friendly, great ride. Nick is the single best driver I've ever had. So these are just a few feedback comments that I've received from my passengers. We get a weekly update based on our star rating, so passengers can rate us as well as we can rate the passengers. So if we have a bad experience, they can rate us. So it's very safe on that side of things as well. So as you can tell, the passengers are loving it. So I just want to say thank you guys very much for allowing us to come into Columbus and continue to hopefully stay around.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker is Karen Manrus. I'm sorry? Manrus. You may have identified the drill by now. Name, address, organizations, 3 minutes.
Okay. Karen Manross, 7111 White Butterfly Lane in Reynoldsburg. I work for a technical company myself. I own my own business, Technical Ingenuity. So when a colleague of mine mentioned Lyft before they actually got into Columbus, explained the app and all of that, I was needing to check that out. And once I did, I actually started the first night that they launched and was super impressed at everything the actual app has to offer and how easy it is for anybody, And I had the ability to also lift Annette and family as well at separate times and take Annette into UDF and get ice cream. Must be something about ice cream. And help her bring it back to the car and bring it home inside the house with her. So it's been a wonderful experience. It's almost like family. A lot of the repeat lifters that I get, we have good discussions in that, and it's a tight-knit thing. So again, the technology is superior. Seeing Lyft in action and the safe transport option for our city, I was hooked. Almost to the point where I like lifting better than my own business. So I'm not sure if they have Lyft Anonymous, but something needs to be happening there. I also do another thing on the side. I have more experience in understanding the college kids. So I do fan photography at the OSU games, both basketball and football, and I see the typical, what happens to the kids in that, and it is very important that we have safety issues. So I thank you so much, and everybody here for looking forward to that. Doing it on the side, however, if there are too many regulations where I can't afford to do it, I do have to say that I would worry very much that I would continue, and that's something I would really, hate not to do. So. Lyft allows me to meet new people all the time, smile every day, tell stories. I have Lyft lines, okay, and I'm proud of them. I've helped people interview for jobs on our Lyfts. I I've helped people get cars repaired and get them back to work very fast because they've needed to be back in time to continue their job and then get them back to their car to pick it up. I've helped even people not feeling good. So there was a female that she wasn't of age to drive yet. Her mother was signed up for Lyft. She was able to contact a Lyft driver, actually, tap for a Lyft for her daughter. I went to pick her up, took her to get her some medicine and things like that, and bring her back home. And she would not have been able to do that in the speedy fashion that it happened. So Lyft is a wonderful thing, and I do appreciate everything that you guys are doing as well. I just hope you can come to a nice meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker is Morgan Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman, welcome back to council. Name, organization, 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Morgan Kaufman, and I represent Yellow Cab, a local family-run taxi company since 1928. I do not align with the startup tactics nor the danger the peer-to-peer transportation companies have included Columbus in as their popularity has spanned the country. I want to personally and professionally thank City Council, their support staff, and especially Councilperson Zach Klein for understanding the challenging nuances that exist in this space. Convenience, popularity, and discounted rates are compelling reasons to take note of these masterful TNCs, business plans. However, not at the expense of public safety. Thank you for recognizing both sides of this model. We do support technology and the necessity of change. Our taxis and paratransit vehicles are outfitted with GPS, app-driven hails, safety cameras, and alerts triggered by G-force to alert us if a vehicle has acted in an erratic way. We've invested heavily in the safety of our passengers and our drivers. City regulation is critical to identify and enforce minimum safety standards to keep us safe. Again, thank you for being open through this important process.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Next speaker is Dan Ullman. Mr. Ullman, if you just could identify yourself, name, address, any organizations you represent. You have 3 minutes, sir.
My name's Dan Ullman. I'm the claims manager for the Independent Taxi Cab Association of Columbus Incorporated. I was sitting back there listening to all of these people, and I think there's room for both taxi cabs and the peer-to-peer service, but I think the competition has to be fair. I noticed that they don't have to file rates, yet the taxi cabs have to live with the rates that they have. That's unfair competition. That's like putting Ohio State and Michigan in the same stadium, and Ohio State's got the chains and blindfolds. They can't compete. I think that the insurance is unfair. They don't have to have as much as the taxi cabs. Why? I can't help it if they're not full-time drivers. I was also informed that these are supposed to be private vehicles. One of our cabs was in an accident with a Uber vehicle that is owned by a motor company with a livery license. Now, I don't think that's supposed to be part of it either. I think you have to make it fair. The competition is good. But giving them the rate advantage, they can make a decision, well, we'll give everybody 50% off this week. That's not fair. That's not even good for the public. I also have a few other questions. On the insurance end of it, I think the coverage for the peer-to-peer should be the same as the cabs as far as when they're on the street representing the peer-to-peer company, whether they're going to go pick up somebody or they've dropped somebody off and they're going home. They still should be covered by that peer-to-peer coverage. I think that we should know which vehicles are licensed. There is no way that we can check, and when I say we, I'm speaking of the general public, as to whether that is a licensed vehicle or not. With a cab, there's no question. Is a driver permitted to take any vehicle that he owns, or does he have to use a specific vehicle? These are questions I think that we should be answering. Let the cabs go unregulated as far as rates. That would let us compete with the peer-to-peer. Who's collecting the sales tax? Doesn't the city have a separate sales tax in addition to the state? Pardon? The county does. Is anybody collecting that? I think that's important. What about,
Please finish your comments.
I was going to say, what about like the city income tax from what these people are earning? Cabs have to turn in the trip sheets and everything. I think it should be done peer-to-peer.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Gebra Medin Coughlin.
Dear City Council, Mr. Klein, dear ladies and gentlemen, I don't have much to say. I just to mention a few points. The main point is the sticking point. Still, it was a sticking point months ago, and still today is the sticking point about insurance coverage of this peer-to-peer. They try to bring so much confusion, so you cannot easily understand, you know. 1 millisecond they are covered, and the other millisecond they are not covered. I don't understand. I have personal insurance. I can really easily understand it. I have a commercial taxi insurance. I can understand this. But theirs is very complicated to understand. I mean, there is gaps, there is loopholes, and that's one point. And the other one is about the physical exam. As a resident of Columbus and citizen of Columbus, I might use them one day, but I don't want to drive with somebody who doesn't have any physical, I mean, maybe he have, unfortunately have seizure, heart attack or anything, so it's not fair to, of course they will remove it now, but since today, we do physical as a taxi driver, but the peer-to-peer people, they don't do physical, so that's a little bit unfair. It seems to me it's unfair. So the main point is insurance. We have to make sure the insurance works, you know. Still, the Department of Insurance, they did retract the consumer alert. It's still there from the insurance community. They put alert for consumers, you know, to watch this peer-to-peer transportation. So still in there. We have to make sure they cover everybody, you know. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned the physical. As Ms. Ford indicated, the physical requirement will be eliminated for cabs as well as for livery, so it will be equal for everybody. The physical requirement, I thought, brought an interesting discussion. Because in theory, requiring a physical seems like a good thing. I mean, make sure people don't have a history of epilepsy, for example.
Yes.
But in practicality, I'm not sure it actually accomplished what we were trying to do, simply because you could go to a doctor that's not your own, provide very vague medical history, and your doctor could check you out and say that you're fine, and you would have a physical. You know, there's no test, no cheek swab to say that you have a specific illness that we would be concerned about from a public safety standpoint. So the more prudent practice in discussion, I think compromise among several people, at least that I talked with, was having the driver fill out an affidavit, because only the driver knows the driver's personal history. Only you know your personal medical history the best, as I know my own personal medical history the best. So if you fill out an affidavit and claim that you're healthy and you're lying on that affidavit, then you've committed perjury, essentially. So you would be facing criminal charges for lying on an affidavit, which in effect accomplishes the same goal of ensuring that people are healthy in providing the service and being a driver, whether it's a taxi cab driver, a livery driver, or a peer-to-peer driver. So in theory, I think requiring a physical makes you feel good. Hey, we have a physical, I'm in good health. But what you're trying to accomplish in that physical form is really not being captured. It's not really capturing whether you're going to be a healthy driver or not a healthy driver, because there's no guarantee that, one, the physical is going to tell the person, at least the license section, that the person has a history of heart disease or epilepsy, something that, or is cannot see, is blind. Those are things that a physical may or may not capture. So I just thought it was something that it was more of a feel-good measure that had no practice in reality.
Okay, thank you.
And then as far as insurance goes, and I know that the previous speaker mentioned insurance, and I think there's probably a couple more based on who's signing up to speak. In my discussions with representatives like yourself and representatives from Yellow Cab, the cab industry, in a lot of ways, the Lyft and the peer-to-peer insurance coverage is stronger than cabs, because it's $1 million versus the $300,000 requirement. Now, there is a difference if a cab's just driving down the street with no one in the car. No one can argue that, because essentially if no one's in the car for a cab, it's still $300,000. Correct? It's $300,000 all the time,
Yes,
the requirement. Mm-hmm. But again, it goes back to this distinction of whether the person's engaged in commercial activity. A cab could swing over and grab a fare at any time on the corner, whereas a peer-to-peer driver cannot. So in theory, you're always engaged in commercial activity as a taxi cab, and thus the heightened $300,000. As a peer-to-peer driver, there is a difference, because you may not accept a ride, so you may not be engaged in commercial activity, at least the way that I see it. So having your personal insurance cover an accident, and if for whatever reason your personal insurance does not cover the accident, having the supplemental coverage that the legislation requires would then kick in at the $50,000, $100,000, and $25,000 level, which in my opinion, I believe is a reasonable and adequate coverage to ensure that passengers in the vehicle are covered in the event of an accident. But thank you.
I think I understand. But maybe their insurance is stronger, but let's produce the paper. Let's see the papers.
I'm sorry?
Let's see the papers.
Of course, and yes.
Let's see the papers,
Absolutely.
Maybe they're strong, but let's see the papers.
Absolutely.
And number two, we'll see on the street whether they are accepting flag or not flag. I work every night, and I see a lot. So we'll see on the way, I don't know when. If that time it's happened, the accident, I don't know how they're going to cover it. Because his telephone is off, but he accepts the flag,
Mm-hmm. So on the insurance paperwork, the city will not issue a license unless the city is comfortable knowing that the requirements are met. And then as far as a peer-to-peer company driver catching a street hail, we will have enforcement. And if, that happens, then people will be held accountable.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Our next speaker is James Andre. Thank you for coming down, sir.
Thank you.
I know you represent Uber. If you could just re-identify yourself in 3 minutes.
Sure. James Andre, I'm the general manager for Uber in Ohio. Just wanted to thank you, Councilmember Klein, for the time today and the effort you put in this, along with Amanda Ford and the Public Safety Department, of all the hard work. I sort of echo the sentiments of Jim Black from Lyft, that I think we're getting close. I think it's been a lot of work, and we're really close, and that's a good thing for Columbus. I think you'll see that ride sharing and UberX is something that's been embraced in droves by both riders and drivers across the country and here in Columbus. And to the points that were mentioned, I think rider safety and driver safety is a top priority of Uber. We don't need to go through all those now because I think a lot of them have been mentioned. But the background checks that we do, MVR checks, the inspections, the constant in-app feedback to have people let us know how the rides go, it's all really important. I just wanted to address sort of some, maybe what the sticking points were, so some questions today around the insurance. We heard some stuff from Demotech, and I just wanted to be able to comment on some of those things before we walk out of here. Real quick, I'll address some of the stuff that I think it was Mr. Kaufman brought up, which I think is just sort of misinformation I wanted to clarify, just in case anybody at home was unclear. You got to remember that Uber is a technology platform, so we're connecting people looking for rides with available drivers. And on our platform, depending on the city, there's a lot of different options available. So here in Columbus, we have Uber Black, which is where we work with licensed limousine operators in the city and SUV drivers. In other markets, we've partnered with taxi as well. And we've done other things all across the country, from boats to bike messengers, you name it. So the platform is the one that enables that. There was a mention of sales tax. Anybody that works on the platform, if they go over a certain dollar amount, which is stipulated by the law, we'll send them a 1099 at the end of the year, in which they pay all the required taxes on for that. So that's taken care of. From an insurance perspective, I think there's a couple quick things to point out. I want to just run through really quickly our policy, or our two policies, to make sure everybody's clear on how exactly those work. Some of this I know is reiterating here, but we do have that $1 million of liability coverage per incident, and that's when a driver isn't engaged on a trip with a passenger or on the way to pick up a passenger. As you previously just mentioned, this is over 3 times the requirement of a Columbus taxi currently. Also, there's $1 million of uninsured or underinsured coverage as part of that policy. We added this last year. This basically covers in the case of a hit and run, which I think is important. So if you're out, by the way, I think it's important to point out that the current Columbus code does not require any taxi company or taxi driver to carry underinsured or uninsured coverage. So, if you're out in a taxi and you're rear-ended by a drunk driver,
you may finish.
Thanks. There's a chance that there might not be coverage in place in that incident. In the case of Uber, and I believe Lyft as well, there would be $1 million of coverage for, if there was inadequate coverage by another motorist. So I think it's really important. So you're seeing the pattern here of kind of going above and beyond what is currently required in Columbus for the taxi industry. And then just to point out a couple more things about the code as far as the references to collision insurance, et cetera, and the way it's currently proposed. Our coverage provides $50,000 of contingent, comprehensive, and collision insurance in the case that a driver has it elected on their personal policy and it was, for whatever reason, was deemed not to cover. So you talk about, there's been a mention of this exclusion if you're on a commercial activity. That's why these policies were designed this way, to step in and cover from first dollar. So in that case, you'll have, if you've got comprehensive and collision insurance that's found not to apply, we've got a policy that'll step in for you. So, making that a requirement just to have for $25,000 for some of these optional coverage, seems a little strange. And to echo what Jim Black said, this is something that's not a public safety concern as far as a ding and something on the vehicle. And then we've added, we were the first company to add and get in place coverage for the contingent policy in between trips. And the policy of $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident, or $25,000 property damage. Those liability limits are currently double the state of Ohio's requirement. So again, really good stuff in place there. And as the code was currently written, the collision policy being required the moment someone signs on the app, we just think that's that's a period of time that's getting covered by personal insurers. So to have that in there seems a little odd to us. And then, the medical payment stuff I think has been brought up repeatedly. It's another optional coverage in Ohio, typically amounts less than $5,000. The only time this comes into play would be an at-fault driver, as it was mentioned. So, I think all the other mentions of, hey, your collision insurance might not apply, or your underinsured might not apply. That's the purpose of our policy, to drop down, from first dollar in those cases. So we feel pretty good about what we're doing, and we're, excited to move forward as legislation and have something that works for people of Columbus.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, do you want to respond to anything that was said by Mr. Audrey?
My only response is I haven't seen the contingent comp and collision policy. I've read that they have that in place. We haven't seen that or a certificate of coverage, so I can't comment on it. And just to reiterate what he said, these are optional coverages, but I'm simply pointing out where the gaps or the differences might exist. Not advocating for a position either way, but just identifying the gaps.
And I just wanted to comment that calling it a gap when the policy is designed to go back and cover in the instances of collision, underinsured, et cetera, is not a gap to me. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Habte Abagazi. Welcome to council, sir.
My name is Habtai Okubazgi for the Independent Taxi Cab Association of Columbus. Councilmember Zach Lane, thank you for giving me this opportunity. First, I appreciate all the city officials and personnel, especially the city attorney's office, for the efforts made to regulate the peer-to-peer transportation network, even though the city failed to stop them operate without complying with the city rules. This failure may be an opening for many companies to come and challenge the city. The phenomenon will be disadvantage for the small business that is operating legally in Columbus. Here I want to acknowledge that I know Mr. Daffy, who has testified here today. There is some problems that people have, and I'm glad that they have the opportunity to jump from one service to the another. I have known him for a long time, and I gave him a ride several days, and I see him jumping from one taxi cab company to the other taxi cab company, and I consider this opportunities also because Lyft and Uber are new, and the complaints will come later, hopefully not. Another concern is how many vehicles for hire are needed in streets of Columbus. The idea of giving Columbus residents options of transportation is good, but how many does the city need should be addressed. Do we flood the streets with vehicles or have enough to the size of the city? I believe the city have to make a study that is based on real numbers that reflect all concerns and not studies collected by special interests. The licensing standard, like this, the dress code, the rates, the health issue now is solved to the requests probably of the new technology, but still I believe that we need the medical assessment for any person who is responsible on driving vehicle for hire, because that's a public safety concern. A driver is one of the requirements for safety. Doesn't see that a vehicle for hire driver is different than a peer-to-peer driver on the health issue, on the rate, on the dress code. Both transport people, both drive vehicles. The requirements should be all the same. We cannot tell somebody to dress something and other person we don't regulate. I think
you may finish.
briefly, the competition is all right, it's good with us, but let's see the rules and regulations work properly. Thank you.
Thank you. And you mentioned something that has not been talked about today, and that's the issue of the number of vehicles on the street. I believe you were there in the meeting we had in my office where we talked about moratoriums not being part of this conversation, but being part of a future conversation, and in talking with public safety, perhaps even going as far as issuing a study and hiring a consultant to study the city of Columbus to determine whether there should be a moratorium, if there is, what the limits should be. So all of those, I think, are pertinent conversations as we move forward past the regulation stage of peer-to-peer.
Yeah, thank you for letting me know that, but that's a very important issue. I don't want it to be overlooked, and
Yes, sir.
that's why I want to mention it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is David Herring. Thank you for coming down to council, sir.
My name is David Herring. I live at 3422 Burbank. I am the operations manager for Acme Taxi and the vehicle for hire driver's representative. I've been driving a cab for 28 years here in Columbus. I've serviced the elderly, the visually impaired, the handicapped. I've gone grocery shopping. I've carried people in and out of their houses. It hurts my feelings to hear somebody say how horrible cab drivers are or what a horrible experience they have. We have gone in the last 2 years. We have been passing new laws, new regulations to make the cab industry better. We have part-time employees. I have drivers that work once a week, once a month, twice a week, and it's just as hard for them to meet these qualifications as it is anyone else. The insurance qualifications were just doubled on us. I can't drive part-time or subcontract part-time in any business, contract business of any type, without having the correct insurance for my business. They are subcontractors, essentially. They should have the correct insurance, commercial insurance, just like everybody else does. The physicals are required by the federal government for people to drive tractor-trailer trucks or have CDL license. We go to the Department of Transportation physical office and get our physicals. That's where we go. We don't go to the health department or the dentist or somebody to get our physicals. I think a physical is an extreme part of driving, especially, it's one thing if you drive 2 or 3 hours a day, it's another if you drive 12 hours a day. If you have a seizure or heart attack, or like they already openly admitted that some people are physically challenged or they have physical limitations. Some of those limitations keep you from driving a car also, just like standing 8 hours. I don't think an affidavit's going to keep someone from not telling you the truth. It's happened ever since last December. They have yet to tell us the truth. I've still not seen any insurance papers that they tell us they have this fantastic insurance, but it's not there. I can show you my insurance today. The $35 being reduced from the $50, we just raised it to $50 last year. Why are we making it easier for somebody to come in and compete against us? Are we that bad of people that it should be higher for us and cheaper for them? We just raised it for us last year, and now we're going to lower it because they say that it's easier to get their drivers. It'd be easier for us to get drivers too. It would have been easier for us to get drivers for the last 10 years. But nobody stopped it then. Now we want to stop it. I don't understand how that's correct. That's it.
Are you finished?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I certainly appreciate your comments, at least on the $35 fee. It came to at least my attention in discussions with the peer-to-peer companies, the Department of Public Safety, and the cab industry that the increase to $50 could be reduced to $35. I understand it was just increased.
We just had our renewals and paid it.
And from this point forward, if this legislation passes, it will be reduced to $35. I think it goes back to regulation and identifying what the maximum amount of regulation is necessary, but at the same time, understanding that we shouldn't be over-regulation, or we shouldn't be over-regulating. And this is an area where, in my review of the side-by-side comparison of what was being proposed, was one where we could find a way of reducing the fee for everyone involved in providing transportation options in the city of Columbus. So there was no reason why we shouldn't be reducing it from 50 to 35. And if we identify more of those, whether it's a rule or a fee, then we'll tackle those too. But I think when you look at the spreadsheet, you'll see some very close, if not same, similarities between what's required from taxi cab, livery drivers, and peer-to-peer companies. There are some differences. There are a lot of similarities. And because there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences between the two types of service. And certainly, as far as what you have perceived to be demeaning comments about the cab industry, everyone's free to speak on whatever they believe in. I obviously didn't say those things. I've taken cabs many, many, many times in the city of Columbus and have had positive experiences. And this is nothing from my point of view, whether cabs are good or bad, as much as this is another transportation option in the city of Columbus, and how can we identify similarities and make sure those similarities are treated the same, and yet also identify that there are differences, and where there are differences, regulate them in a manner where the public safety is not an issue.
And the rules on the vehicles were just changed for us also, where it says 8 years on the paper that we wrote, we can't put a car on the street that's older than 6 years old. Now that we can keep them up to 8 years or 10 years if they're eco-friendly, but they have to be 6 years old or newer for us to put them on the street. And theirs don't have to be 8 or 10 years old. To me, that's an unfair business. They're getting an advantage over us that we don't have.
Okay, well, I appreciate your comments. Thank you, sir. And the final speaker is Michael Goldsberry. And if you have signed up and for whatever reason I did not call your name, this is the last speaker.
Good evening. First off, my name is Michael Goldsberry. I'm the CEO of Acme Enterprise Incorporated, Acme Taxi. I'd like to thank the offices of the City Council office, as well as the Public Safety Director, Mitchell Brown, and all of the work they've done with Amanda. Beautiful work that they've done on this project. There's been many cities across the nation which have been trying to meet these challenges for regulation as well. And in that respect, I want to say at least this, that they put it in for 6 months, we'll review this legislation, which that is vital, because we have at least a chance to see how this regulation works and to see if it's going to be contingent with everybody else across the nation that's trying to do regulation on these type of road apps. While the city taking the physical out is a good idea practically so that they don't have to come there, I feel like it's a safety issue, because a driver that does not have to see a physical, yeah, they can fake a physical, but at least you're making the effort to get them to go and try attempt to get this physical. You know, it's a check and balances system that would at least allow that driver to show that he's safe to drive. No regulation on fares allows app-based companies to charge what they want. The examples that they had in the lawsuit brought by the city attorney's office is the fares were higher than what the tax cab was on short trips. They may be higher or lower on longer trips. It doesn't matter, though. If they can charge what they want, these companies currently have a policy of raising their fares during peak time or high volume times. In other words, on a Friday night or a Saturday night when the arena district is flooded with people that need taxis, and they can raise their rates 2 to 3 or 4 times what they want to charge on a normal fare. That's pretty consistent with everything I've heard of Uber and Lyft, and I don't know about other app-based companies. But citing other jurisdictions, as the general manager of Uber did, is very premature. There are many cities, state, and federal governments that are addressing the legality of the app-based companies on many different levels of liability, fare rates, and other regulations that differ from a licensed vehicle for hire. We get notes every day from the Taxicab Paratransit Association, and what they do is they document all of the examples of cities that are fighting the rogue-based apps. I'll read just one example of today. The New York City medallion managers, which are banding together to make sure Uber pays the proper sales taxes, are accusing Uber drivers of posing a potential threat and attacking Uber's insistence that they are a tech company rather than a car service. My point is this. The safety department has done a lot of work on this, and they've done an excellent job. However, there needs to be a consistency. They've come up with a lot of regulation that probably will be in place. But we have to keep an open mind that across this nation, there are many companies, or governments, city government, state government, federal governments, that are addressing these apps and whether or not they're legal and what effect they have on the transportation industry within their cities. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. And this, look, I'll be the first to admit that this is a work in progress, and that just like changing the fees from 50 to 35, it was passed recently to, within the past couple months, 50, now it's 30. Like, things can change, and I certainly have an open mind to this, and I think we're heading in the right direction for this particular piece of legislation. And as we move forward to its passage, we'll see how it works based on the constructs, and if things don't work, we'll change it. I mean, I think I'm not afraid to change things if it needs to be changed. And I want to assure the taxi industry, who have brought that point up repeatedly, and that's fine, that if things need to be changed, I'll be the first to admit that they need to be changed, and we'll change them. Just like I thought the change should be a lot more equal level playing field from $50 to $35. Not as complex, but it was one where I felt that was something that should be changed. Again, overburdensome regulation of spending money for licensure. So I do want to give Mr. Black, if he's willing, to come up and talk about your pricing and how that's determined. Please. Because that's been brought up a couple different times, and if you don't, I can have the Uber representative come up. I don't even know. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you back there. But just when you log onto the app, people talk about surge pricing. Do you get a note that there is surge pricing, and how can you determine what your fare is? Is there a way of doing that?
We don't call ours surge pricing. There is something that is sort of demand related, and it's prime time. And yes, you have a number of sort of notices. When you open it up, first, even looking at the map, it will say prime time right on it. When you go to get the ride, it will tell you prime time. It will tell you exactly what the multiple is, if anything. We also have something called happy hour, where the prices can actually go down. And you get notice for that as well. You also get something that tells you when it's over. So if you were waiting for a ride and you said, hey, I don't really want to get it now because I'll wait until prime time's over, you can get notice that prime time's over.
And is there a way to determine your fare with the app? Like if you're going from A to B, to know how much it's going to cost?
You can get an estimate.
An estimate?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to clear that up. And,
sure.
So the consumer knows from the get-go whether there's going to be, I forget the term.
A multiplier of some sort.
A multiplier of some sort.
Yeah,
I didn't want to use
absolutely.
surge pricing. I
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Director Brown, do you have any closing comments?
No, Councilmember.
Ms. Ford, City Attorney Pfeiffer? All right, well, that concludes the hearing. I certainly appreciate what public safety has done, what Demotech has done. Thank you, and certainly all the speakers that have taken their time to come at 2 o'clock. I appreciate the flexibility. I normally like to have hearings at 5, but due to personal schedule, this was the time that I was able to do it. So I appreciate everyone's flexibility to do so. That concludes our hearing. Thank you.